Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today's video is answering a request from PickUpYourPantsPatrol, who asked me to make a video about atheist special pleading, and in particular, that atheists will say that God needs a cause, but that the universe doesn't. So, I'm going to talk about this. Now, unfortunately, this is a little bit outside of my own experience. I've seen things like this, never exactly the thing being talked about. And actually, the funny thing, too, is it feels a little bit more like the sort of video that my friend Rob at Deflating Atheism would make. So I actually went and asked him what he thought and how he would approach it. And not that I'm going to approach it in exactly the same way, but it was interesting because his response is that you have to look at where it's coming from. And that is that no atheist actually believes that God had to have a cause in the sense of, hypothetically speaking. That is to say, they don't really think this. It's sort of a rhetorical dodge that they are using to try to get out of a cosmological argument. Similarly, they don't really believe that the universe didn't have to have a cause. They're more not actually thinking about it and just sort of, again, using a bit of a rhetorical dodge to try to get out of thinking about it. That in both cases, what you have is, one of the cosmological arguments, like for example, the argument from motion. Now, the problem is, of course, the argument from motion is about change. Motion meaning change. Etymologically, you had local motion, that is to say the change in location. Local meaning of or pertaining to location. So the change in location, that is to say, physically moving along. But over time, local motion became basically what we meant by motion, especially sort of after physics, really developed. So unfortunately, people take the argument for motion to be about things like, how did this thing start moving, when it's actually about, from moment to moment, how do things change in the moment, because one moment doesn't contain the next moment, otherwise it would be this simultaneous, to borrow sort of a quantum physics term, superposition of all time, or more to the point, it would be timeless. If a thing contained all subsequent moments in itself, all those moments would simultaneously be present. And so a child, all the way through an adult, would all be at the same time somehow. So that can't happen. It can't be inside of one moment. So you have to, and so you have potential to change being actualized, and the actuality has to come from something which is actual. But this is from one moment to the next. This is, I have a piece of paper and I have a ripped piece of paper. How does the one turn into the other in the action of ripping something actual? In this case, the immediate thing being me, has to be actualizing this potential for it to be ripped. So, but the thing is, that actuality is itself either purely actual or was itself actualized by some sort of other actuality, and so on. And you can't have an infinite regress of this. You can't in time either, but that's a much more complicated argument. Very simply, you can't have an infinite regress because you can't have an infinite regress in the moment. If there is nothing actual that started all the rest of the actualizing the potential into action, then it didn't actually actualize. So there has to be something at the beginning of this chain of causation that is purely actual and not potential, that is to say, does not need to be actualized, that is enabling this actuality to actualize the potential. That is to say, from one moment to flip into the next. It's not about, what's at the beginning of the chain of moments, but how does one moment turn into the next? It's the actual argument. Unfortunately, it tends to be misunderstood into an infinite chain back to the beginning of time. And so the argument essentially becomes, was there a beginning of time, or is time always moving, or what have you? And the funny thing is, you can't have a time always happening, because that's an infinite chain of events that has finished. That is to say, that it's like somebody who has always been climbing out of a well who just got out of the well. You can't have an infinite series that actually terminates. It's intrinsically self-contradictory. This is, however, a very difficult argument, and most people don't seem to get it in any way that I can describe. So I'm still looking for a better description that will make sense to more people. Some people get it, not literally no one. But I'm still looking for a better argument on this. And this is sort of what that argument typically degenerates into. And it would be a much more contentious argument, or the argument would have a very different feel to it, if it weren't for things unveiled by modern science, and in particular the Big Bang. When you look at the universe, it's all expanding out from sort of a central point, which means that at some point it was all together and therefore started. This poses a real massive problem to the atheist community over time, not the one currently at present, because they'd always opted for the "it never got started, it just always been moving" approach. It's much easier to not defend exactly, because they didn't really defend it so far as I can tell through reading, but it's a lot easier to simply sort of assert and say that you can't prove the contrary. Anyway, with the advent of the Big Bang being obvious that our universe definitely did have a start, there then became, for a while I think, one popular way of trying to escape the Big Bang showing that the universe did in fact have a beginning, and so that whole, infinite chain stretching back forever doesn't work, was to try to resurrect it with, well, maybe the universe has a Big Bang and then it's like a rubber band. And then it goes out until the energy's been spent and gravity finally pulls it back and it collapses again. And something about all the matter being collapsed instead of creating a black hole forever makes it go boom again. And so that was the rubber band theory. But that doesn't work. Mostly because of cosmic inflation, in point of fact, that the universe is expanding faster than it used to be. There's a super quick bit of expansion, then it kind of leveled out, but then it's expanding again. You always see those sort of trumpet shapes as the illustration that people tend to use. But the universe is expanding actually at a faster rate. And so this obviously is not the sort of universe that is rubber banding. And so I haven't heard anybody talking about that rubber banding theory in quite some time now. Years, I mean. And so where they kind of have to go with this at this point, when you want to escape God, is you have to go to the universe having created itself. Okay, fine, in some sense, says the person, the universe had a start, but why does that start have to be God? Maybe that start was just a mindless accident in something. Don't know what. We'll call it quantum foam, because, that sounds like that's actually a coherent idea that somebody has that just none of us are experts in. And so this is sort of where you tend to see this now. And so the thing about the argument as it tends to stand is probably one of the more popular ones in light of the Big Bang is the Kalam cosmological argument. Anything that had a beginning had to have, a creator, roughly speaking. I'm actually not real familiar with it. I don't know. I haven't seen the Kalam very often, or not recently. But from what I gather, it's really quite a popular one. And so people try to dodge it, like Richard Dawkins tried to dodge different arguments, actually, but related arguments. In sort of a similar way with, well, if God, if the universe had to have been created by God, then, well, God would have to have a creator too, and so on, in infinite regress. And it's not really, I think, special pleading, not exactly, that they're trying to say that everything had to have a beginning except for the universe. It's rather that they're trying to defeat the idea that it's the universe that, defeat the idea that God created the universe. And they're trying to just establish, well, if things don't need a beginning, then the universe didn't need a beginning either, is really what they're trying to argue towards. And their hope being you can finally get to where the, okay, if things don't need a beginning, even though they had a beginning, like, things don't need a beginning, that's actually slightly incorrect phrasing. It's not a coherent idea, so there's a great description for it, but roughly speaking, if things that had a beginning don't need a cause, then this is the problem. They can't get away from it because God didn't have a beginning. They tend to try to turn it into everything has to have a cause. Because if they actually phrase it correctly, it just falls flat. So if everything had to have a cause, then you can't arrive at God. And so not everything has to have a cause. And at that point, why not just the universe didn't have to have a cause? I mean, everything inside the universe has to have a cause for, reasons or whatever, guess. They don't ask themselves this. But maybe the universe itself didn't have to have a cause. I mean, hey, look, we don't know what the cause is for radioactive decay, and in the models we have of it, we don't have a cause that predicts it, and that's, kind of like saying that the thing itself doesn't have a cause if you can't tell the difference between a model and reality. And so, yeah, see? Look at the waving hands. Tends to be how that argument runs. And so where they're trying to wind up, where they're desperately trying to wind up is, unfortunately, the universe obviously had a beginning, so we just need somehow to get everyone to think, okay, maybe the universe started itself, even though that makes no sense. But, so in a sense, it's not special pleading, but in a sense it is, because they're trying to say that the universe, which is a thing that we actually have some familiarity with, with the nature of, that it's temporal and so on, that it changes, that it's composed of parts and so on, acted like something that isn't. Or, kind of I think where the favorite one goes is, let's postulate something that basically has the same function of God with regard to creation, that is to say creating it, but we'll just posit it to be completely mindless. And so, roughly speaking, what they're actually doing is saying, like, okay, obviously there has to be some sort of God, but we can still save the idea that human beings don't have souls and don't have minds and don't have free will if we just posit that these things are all illusions, and therefore the God who created everything also doesn't have mind or will or rationality. And so instead of calling it God, we'll call it a quantum fluctuation, because that's sort of a safer name for it. It's sort of what they actually really are doing if you look kind of closely. And what's kind of funny is if you actually pull out the Summa Theologica, my copy's right over there on my bookshelf there, what you'll find is that St. Thomas devotes very, very, very little space to showing that God has intelligence. The reason why is because if human beings have intelligence, not in the sense of being machines that happen to do something that we will call clever looking, except we're caught up within this, so there's no way to resolve these words, but instead, if human beings actually have a mind capable of perceiving truth, which we obviously do, we all experience it. We experience this. I mean, maybe some atheists don't. Maybe they don't experience having minds. It would explain an awful lot about the strange sort of arguments they make, or the demands for evidence that they should already have. But in any event, it's possible that some atheists do not in fact have minds, or philosophical zombies, or automatons, some sort of birth defect where they didn't actually receive a soul and they're just sort of incredibly clever apes, something like that. I didn't receive a rational soul. I mean, have just an animal soul. Theoretically possible, don't think it actually happens, but I have no actual evidence one way or the other, except for that some of these people will say, I don't have a soul, and so, well, hell, maybe they're right. I don't know. Anyway, point being, since many of us at least experience having minds and souls and free will and so on, these things obviously had to come from somewhere, and they obviously don't come from matter. And so the spiritual component of this has to come from spirit. And so very clearly these things, because things like mind and soul are irreducible. They're not composed of little parts of a completely different nature from them. These things have to come from somewhere, and so obviously these things too come from God, and therefore, since they come from God, they have to partake in the nature of God in some fashion, and therefore God has intellect. He doesn't even spell it out that clearly, because it's just such an obvious deduction. If human beings actually have souls with minds that are capable of knowledge, then obviously God does too, in a metaphorical sense, since God is in no way directly like us. And so you barely find this argued for, because it's just so incredibly obvious if you hold that we have souls and minds and thoughts and so on. What modern people are trying to do, really, though, is they're trying to deny free will. They're trying to deny that human beings actually have souls and minds. This is, and I think, often very motivating. Not to digress too much, but you actually see determinism popping up over and over again. You see it in Buddhism. You see it in the theology of Martin Luther, the theology of John Calvin. You see it in modern materialism. You see this all over the place. That you have, you have a lack of free will. What you end up But some of them take place, with God. Some of them take place without God. God doesn't seem to be nearly as important in this as the lack of free will. And I think the main reason behind this is because free will means that other people have minds and wills, because mind and will is not really that distinguishable. I mean, they're not separable. They can't exist independently of each other. You can't have a mind that isn't capable of willing, because it intrinsically can direct its attention to something. You can't have a will that isn't capable of perceiving anything or thinking, because it can then therefore not have any object towards which it could be directed. The mind and the will are not, actually separable, capable of independent existence. And so when you have minds and wills, the world doesn't fit in your head. It can't fit in your head. There are just too many things that are bigger than your head out there. And so you can understand them using the physical metaphor of like standing under something and fitting into it, but you can't comprehend it using the physical metaphor of getting it like all inside your head so you're completely around it. And this is really disconcerting to some people. I don't know why myself. I'm quite content to know that there's lots of things that I can't fit inside my head. Incredible, astonishing amount that I can't fit inside my head. The world's a giant place, and it's actually pretty cool. So I can't relate directly, but that said, some people obviously have trouble with this. They cannot deal with the world not fitting inside their head. And so, metaphorically speaking, this is the internet, hey. So, metaphorically speaking, fitting inside their head. And so, they deny the existence of free will and minds in order to make everything comprehensible. Because if everyone's just a robot, then the whole world, then there are just a few rules that everything's following. You can fit those inside your head. And so the rest are just sort of inconsequential details. And so I think the big thing that they really want to save, and you can see why it is that they need this to be God but not called God, so we'll call it a quantum fluctuation, is that they really desperately need everything to boil down to a few simple rules they can fit inside their head, because they have at back a deep-seated need to comprehend everything. Maybe it has to do with some sort of fundamental existential terror, that if you can't have faith in God, then the world's too terrible, and so you have to feel like you can control it or something. I don't know, I'm just guessing there. As I said, I can't relate directly to that need. And no one who's had it has ever explained it. They tend to be pretty incoherent. So, anyway, that is my best guess as to what's going on. When you meet this sort of thing, what's actually happening. I believe it's that. I don't have too much direct experience of it. The sort of people who do this thing are terrible at explaining themselves. Since much of what they say is very reactive in the moment, a lot of it is going to depend on whether you lead them into this or lead them into something else, how they're going to react to it. So that's my best guess for what's going on. I hope that may prove helpful. Once again, thanks to Pick Up Your Pants Patrol for the question. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.